In the chill of an early medieval dawn, before even the rooster crowed, a peasant woman wrapped herself in a homespun woolen shift and stepped out into the dewy silence of the fields. Her garment was coarse and simple, brownish gray and stiff from repeated use and sun-drying. She had woven it herself over the long winter evenings, spinning wool by the fire while her children dozed beside her. This modest tunic, tinged with calloused hands and dyed with the bark of oak, was more than just clothing. It was a marker of her station, her labor, and the rhythms of the world she inhabited. And in this quiet moment, before the world stirred, she wore her social class like a second skin. In the Middle Ages, clothing was never just clothing, it was history, power, faith, and identity made tangible. To understand the medieval world, one need only look at what its people wore. Garments were not simply chosen for warmth or comfort. They were layered with purpose and meaning. A glance at a hemline, a sleeve cut, or the color of a cloak could reveal everything about the wearer. This was a world in which fabric was precious, dyes were magical, and needlework was both necessity and art. As we begin our journey into the fashion of the Middle Ages, we unravel a thread that winds through every class and creed. The term Middle Ages spans nearly 1,000 years, from roughly the 5th to the late 15th century, and fashion evolved dramatically over that time. Early medieval dress was shaped by the remnants of Roman-influenced tunics, cloaks, and simple sandals. As centuries passed, clothing became increasingly complex, reflecting the changing tides of economy, religion, and cross-cultural contact. But one constant remained. Clothing was a visual shorthand for one's place in the world. You didn't just wear clothes, you wore your story, your purpose, your limits. For peasants, clothing was rugged and often dull in hue and dyed wool, faded linens, and repurposed scraps. These clothes were meant to endure the wear of hard labor and frequent mending. One could find small signs of care, a carefully stitched neckline, a family pattern passed through generations, or a token of color saved for holy days. For these communities, fashion may not have been extravagant, but it was personal, tied deeply to land, toil, and family tradition. In contrast, the upper classes draped themselves in a spectacle of wealth and ornament. Rich velvets from Italy, silks from the East, and fine linens from Flanders cascaded across noble shoulders. Gold thread glinted in candlelight. Ermine fur warmed winter banquets. These garments were not just luxurious, they were statements. To wear purple, for instance, was to touch the divine, for that dye, painstakingly derived from sea snails, cost more than silver. To wear tight-fitting garments, tailored close to the body, signaled not only wealth, but modernity of forward-thinking awareness of fashion trends radiating from European courts. Merchants, artisans, and the rising urban classes found themselves caught between these two worlds. As trade flourished and towns expanded, their fashion sensibilities grew more ambitious, no longer content with the somber drab of their ancestors. These groups adopted fitted tunics, colorful hose, and fashionable hats. Their clothing was still practically, after all. They worked, but it also carried ambition. A well-cut garment could open doors, signal success, or imply respectability in a crowded marketplace. For the merchant, fashion was a tool, a way to climb, a quiet form of rebellion against the aristocratic monopoly on style. Religious figures, meanwhile, followed a different set of fashion rules, ones dictated by humility, devotion, and often a renunciation of earthly vanity. the rope at the waist symbolized chastity. The church itself wielded great influence over fashion, dictating what could and could not be worn, issuing sumptuary laws, and linking clothing with morality. It was believed that the way one dressed could reflect the state of one's soul. Clothing also reinforced gender norms. Men's garments were built for mobility, often shorter, layered with hose and boots. Women's clothing emphasized modesty and containment, long gowns, veils, and tightly bound waists. But within these limitations, creativity thrived. Women embroidered, adorned, and repurposed their clothes in small acts of expression. A widow might wear black, but she might also weave her own story into the trim of her sleeve. Young girls were dressed in miniature versions of their mother's gowns, learning early the role fashion would play in their lives. The raw materials of fashion wool, linen, silk, leather were all costly to produce. A single tunic could represent weeks of labor, from spinning and weaving to dyeing and sewing. For this reason, clothing was rarely discarded. It was mended, resized, and handed down. Even the wealthy often restyled old garments to reflect new trends. A noblewoman's gown from one decade might become a chambermaid's uniform in the next. And when clothing finally reached the end of its life, it was often used for rags, bandages, or burial shrouds. In a world without fast fashion, every thread mattered. So we begin our tale not with kings or queens, but with thread and needle, with the quiet hands of countless weavers, dyers, and stitchers who clothed a civilization to signal and to dream through fabric. It is a story worn close to the skin, stitched into time. Long before a tunic graced the back of a medieval peasant or a fur-lined mantle swept the floor of a noble's hall. Its journey began with the raw, unassuming materials of nature. This was a world where clothing began, not in boutiques, but in the soil, the flock, and the field. A single garment could represent an entire village's worth of efforts: spinners, dyers, fullers, and tailors, each lending a hand in its creation. Every thread carried with it a lineage of labor, ingenuity, and seasonal rhythm. Wool was the cornerstone of medieval textiles. Sheep were abundant across Europe, and their fleece was valued not only for warmth, but also for its adaptability. After shearing, the raw wool was cleaned a time-consuming and aromatic process involving soaking, beating, and combing to remove dirt and lanolin. Once dried and carded, the wool was spun into thread by women using drop spindles or spinning wheels. This work was often done by firelight, while songs were sung and stories shared. Spinning was not just a domestic duty, was a rite of passage, a measure of a household's self-sufficiency, and, for many women, a lifelong craft passed from mother to daughter. Flax, from which linen is made, required even greater care, grown in spring and harvested in late summer. Flax stalks were soaked in water to soften the fibers, a process called retting before being beaten and combed. The resulting threads were finer and smoother than wool, perfect for undergarments and garments worn close to the skin. Linen was prized for its breathability and cleanliness, though it stained easily and required more maintenance. For wealthier individuals, linen undershirts were a luxury that added a layer of comfort beneath the rougher outer layers of wool. For the poor, a single linen shift might be their most treasured possession. Silk, by contrast, was the fabric of dreams. Imported from Byzantium, Persia, and later China, silk dazzled the medieval eye with its sheen and softness. Only the wealthiest could afford even a ribbon of it. Entire fortunes were built on the silk trade, and laws were often passed to restrict who could wear it. The mystery of silk's origin, wrapped in cocoons and produced by worms only, added to its exotic allure. To wear silk in the Middle Ages was to touch something nearly divine, a shimmer of the unreachable brought close to the body. Once raw fibers were spun into threads, they faced the next transformation, dyeing. Medieval dyes were drawn from the natural world, madder root for red, woad for blue, weld for yellow. The process was both art and alchemy. Dyers used large vats of boiling water, stirred with sticks, and scented by strange concoctions. The most prized colors, such as deep purple or brilliant scarlet, were reserved for royalty or the church, requiring rare ingredients like crushed insects or mollusks. The colors one wore were not just aesthetic, they could signal allegiance, profession, marital status, or piety. With dyed thread ready, weaving could begin. This was often done on upright looms, operated by trained weavers in towns and monasteries. The warp and weft were skillfully interlaced, creating bolts of cloth that could finally be cut and sewn into garments. Weavers were respected craftsmen, and in many regions they formed powerful guilds to protect their trade secrets and ensure quality. A beautifully woven fabric wasn't just a commodity, was a point of pride, a symbol of community craftsmanship, and, in some cases, a diplomatic gift between rulers. After weaving, the fabric needed Falinga process of washing and beating the cloth to thicken and soften it. Fullers worked in specialized mills or with their feet in shallow vats, trampling the wet cloth, often with the aid of fuller's earth or urine, to clean and bind the fibers. The resulting fabric was then stretched on tenter frames, hence the expression on tenterhooks, and finally brushed, clipped, and pressed. By the time it reached a tailor's hands, the fabric had undergone months of handling, across seasons and guild lines, each step a labor of time and expertise. Tailors, both male and female, transformed these bolts into clothing, following patterns passed down through generations. For the rich, garments were custom-fitted with delicate stitching, lined with fur or embroidered with precious threads. For the poor, tailors repurposed second-hand fabric or made do with whatever scraps were available. Even among the lower classes, skilled tailoring was appreciated. A well-cut tunic or snug-fitting hood could offer both dignity and warmth. Tailoring was also one of the few crafts where women could gain independence, especially widows or unmarried women who took up the needle professionally. This entire process, from shearing to stitching, could take months, even years. Clothing was never disposable. It was valued, maintained, and often reused. A nobleman's cloak might later be trimmed and worn by his steward, then cut down further for a child's jacket. Fabric moved through social strata, carrying its history with it. In a time before mass production, every seam bore the marks of countless hands, and each garment told a story, not just of who wore it, but of who made it and why. So when we speak of medieval clothing, we speak not only of appearance, but of processor, great collaborative dance between nature and humanity. Each tunic, coif, gown, and glove was a testament to patience, skill, and the enduring desire to shape beauty from raw material. To wear clothes in the Middle Ages was to wear the work of many, stitched together across time and trade. It was a ritual, a relic, and a responsibility woven deep into the rhythms of life. Beneath the thatched eaves of a village cottage, a man laced up his cross-gartered hose as the first rays of sunlight stretched across a dew-covered field. His tunic, worn thin at the elbows and patched at the hem, was one of his few possessions. It had been mended so many times it bore the marks of 3 winters and perhaps 2 owners before him. This was the reality for the vast majority of people living in the Middle Ages, those who worked the land, tilled the soil, and lived modest lives shaped by the changing seasons. The clothing of the peasantry was not designed for decoration or display, but for function, durability, and survival. A peasant's daily attire was simple: a tunic, usually knee-length for men, often belted with a cord or leather strap, a pair of woolen hose, a linen undershirt, if one could be afforded, and a hood or coif to protect the head. Women wore ankle-length wool dresses over long linen shifts, sometimes cinched with aprons or belts. Color was rare and generally limited to the muted tones of natural dyes, soft browns, dull greens, and grays. Brightly colored garments were nearly always out of reach, both economically and socially. To wear something red or blue was not just impracticable, might be illegal, depending on the sumptuary laws of the region. Most peasants owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothing. Washing was labor-intensive, and so garments were often worn for many days in a row. Clothes were made from scratch at home or handed down, traded or purchased second-hand from traveling vendors. Spinning and weaving were often done during winter, when agricultural work slowed. Women of the household were expected to know how to sew, mend, and improvise, turning worn-out garments into useful items like kerchiefs, baby wraps, or rags. There was no waste, and every thread mattered. Footwear was a luxury for many, especially during the warmer months. Some peasants went barefoot in their daily labor, reserving their leather shoes or wooden clogs for church or feast days. These shoes were often handmade, sometimes without soles, and rarely waterproof. In colder regions, simple woolen wraps might be tied around the feet or stuffed into wooden sabots. The hardship of rural life was reflected in every article of clothing: frayed hems, soot-stained collars, patches upon patches. Seasonal changes required creative adaptations. In the winter, peasants layered on wool cloaks or mantles, often shared among family members or villagers. These were fastened with brooches or pins made of bone or iron. Mittens and hoods were sewn from leftover wool scraps, and straw or hay was occasionally used for insulation. In the summer, tunics were lighter, and work was done in linen when available. For protection from the sun, wide-brimmed hats of straw or felt were used, and sleeves might be rolled or pinned up with wooden toggles. Even the poorest peasants had moments when their appearance mattered: weddings, market days, religious festivals. On such occasions, a family might reveal their best garment: a carefully kept woolen surcoat or a dyed tunic reserved only for sacred days. These moments allowed even the humblest villager a glimpse of dignity, a chance to be seen, respected, and adorned. The difference between everyday wear and feast day garb was stark, and the effort to maintain these pieces was often a communal task, with neighbors lending needles and cloth. Children wore miniature versions of adult clothing, though often with less structure and more freedom of movement. A young boy might run through a muddy lane in a shortened tunic, barefoot and bareheaded, while girls wore simplified gowns tied with cords. Clothing for children was rarely new. It was almost always repurposed from older garments. As they grew, their clothes were let out or pieced together again, making medieval children's clothing a patchwork testament to their growth and survival. Hair and head coverings also held meaning. Women, married or unmarried, were generally expected to cover their hair with veils, coifs, or wimples, though rural customs were sometimes more relaxed. Men might wear hoods, caps, or straw hats, depending on the season and the work at hand. The head was considered both a vulnerable place physically and a symbolically charged one. Covering it was often an act of modesty and respect. In some cases, regional styles of headwear could even identify which village or valley a person came from. Despite the harshness of rural life, the clothing of peasants bore a quiet beauty. The lines of a well-worn tunic, the hand-spun threads of a cloak, the lovingly darned patch on a child's himal told stories of resilience, adaptation, and pride. These were not people unconcerned with their appearance. They simply expressed it differently, through function and continuity, rather than extravagance. Their clothing, humble though it was rooted deeply in a world of seasonal rhythm, familial care, and unspoken tradition. In the grand halls of history, the clothing of the common folk is rarely celebrated, yet it formed the backbone of medieval life, sewn not with gold or pearls, but with patience, practicality, and endurance. The peasant's wardrobe was not a costume, it was armor against the elements, a badge of labor, and a mirror of daily reality. To wear it was to carry not only one's own story, but also the legacy of countless hands before. At first glance, a medieval village might appear drab, the people clothed in a quiet sea of earth tones, smudged grays, and mossy greens. Yet, to the medieval eye, this subdued palette was far from dull. Each hue carried with it the story of the land, the bark of trees, the iron in the soil, the herbs and flowers gathered from field and forest. For the commoner, color was not merely a decorative choice, it was a reflection of access, of labor, and of natural limits. What a person wore was shaped not by personal preference alone, but by what nature and circumstance allowed. The medieval dyeing process was complex, and natural dyes were both regional and seasonal. The peasant woman who wished to add a hint of green to her wool might steep nettles, weld, or even cow parsley in boiling water, experimenting with time and temperature to find the right shade. Onion skins offered yellow-orange hues. Walnut husks produced deep browns. Oak galls yielded dusky grays. The colors produced were subtle, often variable, and never guaranteed to be permanent. Fading with each wash and sun-drying, the tones softened into the countryside itself, blending seamlessly with the muddy lanes, thatched roofs, and woven hedges of peasant life. Brighter and more saturated colors, crimson, deep blues, vivid purples, rare ingredients, or chemical fixatives that were beyond a commoner's reach. Madder root, used for red, could sometimes be obtained, but required soaking, fermenting, and precise handling. Woad, the plant source of blue, was difficult to grow and more difficult still to process, needing urine or other caustic agents to extract its pigment. As a result, true blues and vibrant reds were often reserved for the wealthier classes, both because of cost and because of law. Sumptuary regulations in many regions forbade common folk from wearing certain colors, lest they blur the visual distinction between the classes. Even so, some peasants managed to incorporate color into their wardrobes in small, meaningful ways. A belt dyed with elderberries might shine purple for a season. A headscarf boiled in a pot of tansy flowers could hold a hint of gold. These were quiet acts of adornment, expressions of pride and identity stitched into otherwise modest garments. Festival days, church feasts, or village weddings provided rare occasions to show off such efforts. A peasant bride, for example, might wear her only green tunic trimmed with hand-dyed thread, her hair wrapped in a colored ribbon passed down from her mother. Beyond aesthetics, color also held cultural and spiritual meaning. White, for instance, was associated with purity and was often used for christening robes or burial shrouds, though true white linen required significant effort to produce. Red could symbolize vitality or danger, and even a single red stitch might carry protective associations woven in as a charm against evil. In some areas, wearing black was associated with mourning, but achieving a deep black dye was so expensive that most mourners wore undyed or dark brown clothing instead. The symbolic language of color was rich, though it was shaped by the practicalities of medieval life. Clothing for work rarely carried color, as dyed fabric wore out faster, and stains were harder to conceal. Everyday tunics and shifts were usually left in their natural white for linen, beige, or gray for wool. But for sleeping garments, special gatherings, or garments gifted at major life events, a touch of color added a dimension of care. A child's christening gown, a woman's wedding shift, or a man's burial cloth might all bear signs of extra attention. A colored border, an embroidered cuff, or a patterned hem, hinting at a deeper connection between garment and life milestone. Dyeing itself was often done in the home, though some villages had local specialist soldier women or herbalists who knew the secrets of roots and flowers. The dye pots were usually crude iron or copper vessels, and the smell of boiling bark and rotting plant matter filled the air for hours. Children helped gather materials in the woods, and older women passed down recipes orally, tweaking them based on weather, water quality, or even superstition. Dyeing was part chemistry, part craft, and part magica, transformation of the mundane into the meaningful. While modern eyes might overlook the artistry of these subdued tones, the subtlety was its own kind of beauty. A cloak with the faint green of nettle dye, stitched at the shoulder with blue thread saved from a festival past, held as much pride and personality as a lord's jeweled mantle. It spoke of resilience, resourcefulness, and rootedness. In a world without industrial production, every color had a cost, not just in coin, but in time, effort, and inherited knowledge. Ultimately, the colors of the commoner were the colors of the earth itself. They reflected the landscape, the seasons, and the limitations of one's station. But within those limits, medieval villagers found ways to express identity, belonging, and beauty. Their clothes may have lacked the dazzle of courtly fashion, but they bore the deeper shine of care washed in streams, dried in sunlight, and dyed with the patient labor of lives lived close to the land. Step into the medieval world on a brisk spring morning, and you'd find that no matter a person's rank, their silhouette was shaped not by a single garment, but by many. The layering of clothing wasn't merely a matter of fashion, it was essential, in castles and cottages alike. The absence of modern heating and insulation meant that to be warm was to be wise, and wisdom came stitched in folds. Whether in the smoky chill of a peasant's hearth or the drafty grandeur of a noble hall, people cloaked themselves in garments that wrapped, fastened, and hung in deliberate succession. Each layer served its purpose, and together they formed a shield against the elements and a signal to the world. The base of every outfit was the innermost garment, often made of linen chemise or shift for women, a shirt for men, worn directly against the skin. It absorbed sweat and oils, protecting the outer garments from wear. These pieces were the most frequently laundered items in a person's wardrobe, and they were often the only items washed with regularity. Linen was chosen not for luxury, but for its coolness and ability to soften with use. Though often hidden, these underlayers were intimate garments, sometimes passed between lovers, sometimes embroidered with initials or symbols, making them quiet bearers of emotion. Above this came the layer of structure and modesty, tunics for men and gowns for women. For commoners, these were typically made of coarse wool in straight, simple cuts. The sleeves might be tight or loose, the hems short or trailing, depending on fashion, function, and region. These garments were belted at the waist to adjust, fit, and to carry small items like pouches, knives, or tools. For women, an apron might be added to protect the gown during work, and for both sexes, this middle layer was where personal style could cautiously emerge through small embellishments, colored stitching, or the way a garment was wrapped or tied. The outer layers added warmth, weather resistance, and a clear indication of one's status. Cloaks, mantles, surcoats, and tabards were worn according to class and occupation. A peasant might wear a rough wool cloak pinned at one shoulder with a bone clasp. A merchant could sport a fur-lined surcoat with wide sleeves. A noble might don a finely tailored houppelande with long, sweeping folds and a patterned lining glimpsed with each movement. These outer garments were often the most expensive part of a wardrobe, and the fabric, cut, and fastenings were key indicators of wealth and social position. Head coverings were also layered. A linen coif or cap might be worn beneath a felted hat, and a hood with an attached cape chaperon could be layered on top. For women, especially married ones, modesty dictated that hair be covered with veils, wimples, or headrails, with variations depending on local custom. In colder months, an outer hood made of thick wool or fur-lined cloth was essential. The layering of the head was not just practical, but ceremonial. Hands and legs, too, were layered. Men and women both wore hose or leggings, often tied to a belt or girdle under the tunic to keep them up. These could be footed or open, dyed or natural. Beneath these, in winter, people stuffed straw, rags, or even animal fur for insulation. Gloves or mittens were worn outdoors, usually of leather or wool, and were a prized item, often handmade and passed down. For those of higher status, gloves could be richly embroidered or perfumed, serving as fashion accessories as much as practical wear. Children, like adults, wore layers suited to their age and family wealth. Young boys and girls wore tunics until around age 7, often belted and worn with hoods or cloaks. As they grew older, their clothing began to mimic adult fashion more closely, with additional layers added for modesty and protection. Since children outgrew garments quickly, clothing was often made with room to grow or inherited from older siblings, patched and resized as needed. Seasonal considerations further influenced the art of layering. In the winter, layers were thickened and sometimes doubled, with woolen linings added to cloaks or fur trimmings sewn onto collars and sleeves. In the summer, lighter wool or linen garments were worn, and layers could be loosened, unbelted, or tied up for cooling. Yet, even in the heat, people were rarely bare-armed or uncovered. The sun was harsh, and exposure was frowned upon, particularly for women, whose modesty was closely scrutinized in both religious and social terms. Though much of layering was practical, it also had its moments of flair. The way a cloak was slung, the color of the undergown peeking through the top layer, the angle of a hat, or the tassel of a belt-all, of these allowed for small, expressive choices. A man might fold back his hood to show a bit of lining. A woman might lace her gown to reveal a hint of embroidery. These minor details whispered style in a world that rarely shouted it. For those with the means, layers could be fashion statements. For those without, they were survival tools. To dress in layers in the Middle Ages was to participate in a centuries-old choreography. Each piece had its place, each stitch its purpose. It was a system designed to preserve warmth, signal identity, and adapt to a world both beautiful and brutal. Whether wrapping oneself for the plow or the court, the medieval person engaged in an act that was both utilitarian and symbolic. Layers were armor, warmth, and language, a woven expression of life lived close to the earth, yet always aspiring toward something more. Among the many materials used in medieval clothing, few held as much quiet power as linen. At first glance, it may seem the humblest of fabric spell, simple and unassuming. Yet, in the intricate hierarchy of medieval fashion, linen was a material that whispered rather than shouted. It clung to the skin of noblemen and peasants alike, serving as the first and often only defense against filth and discomfort. But beneath its modest appearance lay a deep cultural significance. Linen represented more than comfort. It symbolized cleanliness, status, and civility in a world where hygiene and social grace were closely intertwined. Derived from the flax plant, linen required an extraordinary amount of labor to produce. Fields of blue-flowered flax were grown in specific regions, Flanders, Ireland, and parts of France being most renowned for their quality. After harvest, the plants had to be retted in water, broken, scotched, and heckled, terms that described the tedious stages of separating the fine fibers from the woody stems. The result was thread that, when woven, formed a cool, crisp fabric capable of becoming softer and stronger with use. This labor-intensive process meant that high-quality linen was always in demand and often beyond the reach of the very people who helped produce it. For the peasant, linen was precious. A single shift might be all a person owned, worn daily beneath woolen garments, and washed when weather and water allowed. These shifts were rarely dyed, their off-white color becoming more yellowed or grayed with time. Even so, owning linen was a sign of modest pride. Families passed down linen garments through generations, repairing worn spots with invisible stitches and treating them with lye, soap, and sun-bleaching techniques to preserve their brightness. The effort taken to clean and care for linen was immense, and the resulting appearance of cleanliness was socially significant even among the poor. Among the middle and upper classes, linen served both practical and symbolic functions. Nobles wore finely spun linen undershirts and chemises, which were often embroidered along the neckline or cuffs. These garments were rarely seen in public, but their presence was understood. To wear linen close to the body was to protect the outer garments from sweat and oils. This preserved expensive silks and velvets, which were difficult to launder. It also allowed the wearer to change their linen undergarments frequently, maintaining an air of freshness that was especially prized in courtly life. Clean linen became a badge of refinement, a kind of invisible luxury. In monastic and ecclesiastical settings, linen was particularly revered. Monks and nuns wore linen habits or undergarments as a mark of purity and humility. Altar cloths, communion veils, and shrouds were all made of linen, symbolizing the spiritual ideal of cleanliness. The association of white linen with religious ritual elevated it beyond the realm of fashion. It became sacred of fabric, suitable for the presence of God. To be wrapped in linen at birth in sacrament, and at death was to be enveloped in a material that transcended class and touched upon the divine. Linen also played a key role in women's fashion, where it structured and supported the elaborate silhouettes of noble garments. Beneath layers of wool or silk, women wore linen chemises, stiffened bodices, and head coverings. Veils and wimples were almost always made of fine linen, the translucence and softness of the fabric allowing for subtle elegance. A noblewoman's veil might be 3 feet long, flowing behind her in an ethereal train, or intricately folded to reflect the latest French or Burgundian styles. Even among the merchant class, a well-starched linen cap or carefully pressed wimple could elevate a woman's appearance and signal domestic discipline. Linen was also integral to sleep. Nightshirts and bed linens, when available, were made from the fabric, offering coolness in summer and comfort year-round. The softening of linen with each wash made it increasingly valuable over time. Older linen garments were never wasted. They became handkerchiefs, bandages, baby swaddles, or linings for new clothing. The cycle of linen was nearly endless, and even its threads were collected for mending or lace making. This recycling was both practical and, in a way, poetic, an acknowledgement that every scrap of labor retained its worth. The presence of linen in burial customs further emphasized its cultural weight. In many Christian communities, the deceased were wrapped in linen shrouds before interment, a nod to the burial of Christ and a final act of dignity. A clean shroud, bleached and unadorned, was considered a mark of respect regardless of wealth. In some cases, the finest linen a person owned was reserved for this moment. Thus, linen was with a person from cradle to grave, silent witness to life's most intimate transitions. Though it lacked the shimmer of silk or the heft of velvet, linen held a central place in medieval life and dress. It was a fabric of paradoxes, humble yet elite, ordinary yet sacred, invisible yet essential. In the Middle Ages, to be wrapped in linen was to be civilized, clean, and human in a world that was often anything but. Its texture on the skin, its smell after drying in the sun, and its quiet resilience told a story of endurance and refinement. In the end, it was not the golden thread or the jeweled brooch that defined medieval fashion, but the quiet, cool touch of linen closest to the heart. As medieval cities swelled with trade, and the scent of spices and tanned leather filled the winding streets, a new figure emerged between the peasant and the lord. The merchant, neither tied to the soil nor born into noble blood. The merchant carved a path through commerce, cunning, and community. And as their fortunes grew, so did their wardrobes. Their clothing was neither as rough as the peasants, nor as extravagant as the nobles. Yet it carried its own kind of statement, one made not of lineage, but of ambition. In the shifting urban centers of the High Middle Ages, clothing became a tool of self-presentation, aspiration, and calculated respectability. Merchants dressed with purpose. Their daily wear needed to withstand the dust of the road, the chill of the market, and the scrutiny of peers and patrons. A typical merchant's outfit began much like that of a nobleman, with a linen shirt or chemise, a woolen tunic, and hose. But where a noble might favor costly silk or velvet, the merchant chose tightly woven, high quality, wooled in deeper hues than a peasant could afford, but not so rich as to invite accusations of vanity. Dark greens, muted reds, and soft blues were common, paired with cloaks or surcoats that were lined for warmth, but not ostentation. The fit of a merchant's garments was key, unlike the loose robes of the country or the flowing gowns of the aristocracy. The urban merchant favored a tailored look, a tunic that narrowed at the waist and flared slightly at the hip, sleeves that hugged the arms, and hose that revealed a strong and upright frame. This silhouette, practical for walking, riding, and negotiating, became synonymous with the growing urban elite. It projected industriousness and control virtues central to a class who earned rather than inherited. Accessories were where a merchant might indulge in subtle signs of success. A leather belt, finely tooled and fitted with a brass or bronze buckle, was both functional and decorative. From it might hang a purse, a ring of keys, a short dagger, or a wax tablet for recording debts. Gloves, often of soft leather, could be tucked into the belt or worn during formal meetings. Hats were another essential. Felted caps, wide-brimmed hats in the Italian style, or embroidered chaperones gave a merchant gravitas. A well-chosen hat signaled taste, intelligence, and engagement with fashion trends emanating from urban centers like Paris, Venice, or Bruges. The fabrics themselves revealed a merchant's sphere of influence. A Flemish wool cloak might suggest access to northern trade routes. A lining of fur hinted at Baltic ties. A strip of striped cotton, rare and foreign, whispered of dealings with the Levant. As trade routes expanded in the late medieval period, clothing became a map of global connection. Merchants brought back not just goods, but patterns, fabrics, and ideas. A merchant's wardrobe was, in essence, a walking testament to the routes they navigated and the risks they took. Though merchants were keen to display success, they also had to navigate the boundaries of sumptuary law and social expectation. In many cities, laws prohibited non-nobles from wearing certain fabrics, furs, or colors. These laws were unevenly enforced, but a merchant flaunting too much wealth risked fines or worse, suspicion. As such, many opted for understated elegance. A garment might be lined in fur, but concealed. A brooch might be modest, but of fine craftsmanship. The aim was to appear prosperous, but not presumptuous, respectable, but not rebellious. Women in merchant families walked a similar line. Their gowns were carefully fitted, with close bodices and long sleeves that often flared at the wrist. They favored layered linen and wool, occasionally adorned with a narrow strip of embroidery or fur at the collar. A merchant's wife might wear a modest veil or a crisp linen headdress folded into fashionable horns or crescent shapes, particularly in later centuries. Jewelry was minimal, perhaps, a single brooch, a chain, or a ring. Their role as hostesses, shopkeepers, and accountants made practicality a priority, but elegance remained a virtue in civic life. In public, clothing served not only as self-expression, but also as advertisement. A merchant's reputation hinged on trust and appearance. Clients and partners needed to believe in his success, sobriety, and stability. Sloppy dress could imply carelessness in trade. Excessive finery could hint at vanity or fraud. Thus, merchant families developed a refined, aesthetic, neat, structured, tasteful. Their garments were often cleaner than those of peasants, more tailored than those of nobles, and more durable than either. They had to last, to travel, to represent a name. The children of merchants were also dressed with care. Boys often wore tunics and hose like their fathers, while girls were clad in miniature versions of their mother's gowns. Education and religious instruction meant their clothing needed to allow movement, but also signal discipline. These children were being groomed not only for the family business, but also for roles in local guilds, town councils, or marriages that would elevate the family's status further. Even in childhood, Clothing was part of their social training. In time, the merchant class would rise to challenge the very foundations of medieval hierarchy. But in this era, their fashion walked the tightrope of progress and propriety. Theirs was a world of sleeves rolled for work, collars fastened for meetings, and cloaks pinned just so for the guild hall or the chapel. Through careful stitches and cautious choices, they dressed for both success and survival, layering ambition over modesty and function over flair. In doing so, they reshaped the fabric of society, one measured garment at a time. In a quiet corner of the bustling medieval town, beneath a wooden sign marked with shears and thread, a tailor sat hunched over a length of fine wool, his fingers deftly guiding a needle through the cloth. The room around him was cluttered with tools of the trade wooden forms, iron shears, chalk, pins, and scraps of fabric in every imaginable shade. On the wall, patterns traced on parchment fluttered in the breeze from a nearby window. Outside, the streets rang with the sounds of commerce, but within this workshop there was only the hush of concentrated labor and the soft hiss of thread pulled taut. Tailors were the unsung architects of fashion in the Middle Ages, shaping not just garments, but entire social impressions with every measured cut. In the early medieval period, much of clothing production, spinning, weaving, sewing was done at home. But as towns grew and wealth began to concentrate in urban centers, a professional class of tailors began to emerge. These craftsmen, occasionally women, especially widows, dedicated their lives to understanding cloth, fit, and form. A good tailor had not just skill, but vision. He needed to know how a sleeve should fall, how a bodice should contour, how to disguise a crooked shoulder or flatter a stooped frame. In an era before standardized patterns, tailoring was both technical and artistic, a blend of measurement and intuition. Measurements were taken using cords or strips of parchment, carefully wrapped and marked. Since rulers varied between regions, tailors relied more on proportion than precision. The human body was divided into standard units: the length of a forearm, the span between shoulders, the girth of the waist. Tailors developed a sense for geometry, how triangles and trapezoids could be fitted together from rectangular cuts of fabric to create curves and drape. Cutting cloth was an irreversible act, so great care was taken before the first snip. Cloth was expensive, and mistakes were costly. A miscut garment might mean starting again with scrapsaw, explaining failure to an impatient patron. Tools were simple but effective. Shears, forged by blacksmiths, were large and heavy, requiring strong hands. Needles, often made of bone or iron, varied in size for different materials. Thimbles protected fingers from endless hours of pressure. Tailors used waxed thread, often spun at home, and pins carved from bone or horn to hold pieces in place. Chalk or charcoal marked lines, and wooden forms helped shape collars and shoulders. The workshop was a space of quiet ingenuity, where centuries-old techniques met the ever-evolving styles of town and court. Fashion began to shift in the 12th and 13th centuries as tailoring advanced. Garments became more fitted with curved seams and gussets that hugged the body. This was a departure from the loose, draping robes of the early Middle Ages. Suddenly, it mattered how clothes sat on the shoulders, how sleeves narrowed at the wrist, how skirts flared from the hips. The concept of a fashion silhouette was born not just wearing clothes, but sculpting the body through them. Tailors became more than craftsmen. They became style makers, Guilds soon formed to regulate the profession. In cities across Europe, tailors' guilds enforced training standards, protected trade secrets, and set pricing for labor and materials. Apprenticeship could last several years, during which a young tailor learned not only to sew, but also to understand clients, manage supplies, and navigate the ever-changing whims of fashion. Journeymen traveled from town to town, honing their skills, and only after years of service could one open a shop and claim the title of master tailor. The guilds also provided a form of social support, offering burial funds, dowries for daughters, and protection during times of war or famine. The role of the tailor extended beyond the shop. Tailors were present at court. They served the church, crafting vestments and altar cloths. They worked with theatrical troupes, constructing costumes for religious dramas and mystery plays. In some cases, they acted as confidants to their clients, privy to personal measurements and intimate fittings. The relationships between tailors and their patrons were built on trust and discretion. A poorly sewn tunic or an overly tight sleeve could embarrass a nobleman at a feast or a merchant at a guild gathering. Women also had a place in the tailoring world, especially as seamstresses, embroiderers, and haberdashers. In some cities, women's tailoring became its own specialized trade. Seamstresses crafted undergarments, veils, wimples, and children's clothing. Their work was often overlooked in records, but was essential to the daily operation of a household or workshop. In convents and almshouses, women sewed garments for the poor, using tailoring not for profit, but for charity and spiritual service. Though rarely given titles, their labor supported every layer of society. Tailoring also had a subversive edge. With the right fabric and the right cut, clothing could challenge the status quo. A merchant might dress like a gentleman. A servant might mimic a noble. Tailors sometimes found themselves caught between ambition and regulation, creating garments that flirted with the boundaries of legality. Sumptuary laws targeted tailors as much as wearers, and guild records occasionally mention fines or reprimands for those who dared to fit a silk sleeve onto a commoner's tunic. But fashion was, even then, a force that resisted control. In the end, the tailor was more than a tradesman. He was a mediator between class and cloth, a sculptor of status, a weaver of identity. In a world where people were judged by their garments, tailors gave shape to dreams, dignity to the poor, elegance to the rising merchant, and power to the noble. Their tools were simple, their work exacting, and their influence enduring. Every stitch was a quiet act of transformation, turning fabric into meaning, one careful seam at a time. In the flickering light of a magistrate's chamber, a clerk dipped his quill and began transcribing yet another decree. This one, like many before it, detailed who could wear what: velvet only for the nobility, scarlet for knights and above, fur-lined garments restricted to landed gentry. These were sumptuary laws, an effort by rulers and councils to control not just fashion, but the very flow of status, power, and social order. In the medieval world, clothing was never a private affair. It was a public declaration, and its regulation became a matter of civic importance. The loom, in all its quiet labor, was governed not just by hand and thread, but by law. Sumptuary laws had existed in the ancient world, but they flourished in medieval Europe, particularly from the 13th century onward. These laws were a response to rising economic mobility. As merchants grew wealthy and artisans gained influence, traditional social distinctions began to blur. Nobles, once easily identified by their finery, now found themselves imitated by commoners in imported cloth and tailored coats. The laws thus served a dual purpose: to reassert the authority of the aristocracy and to maintain visual order in a stratified society. Each region crafted its own regulations. In England, a law passed under Edward III stated that no one beneath the rank of knight could wear cloth of gold, imported silk, or sable fur. In Florence, only members of the noble class could wear certain lengths of train on their gowns, and the width of sleeves was strictly measured. In Paris, tailors were forbidden to create garments with more than a specified number of buttons or embellishments for clients below certain incomes. Across Europe, colors, fabrics, trims, and even the height of shoe points were scrutinized and legislated. The laws often reached into the absurd. In some Italian city-states, women were forbidden from wearing more than one jeweled ring per hand, or from having more than a certain number of pleats in their gowns. In Venice, a merchant's wife could be fined for wearing pearls, even if they were family heirlooms. These restrictions were sometimes met with quiet compliance, but just as often with clever defiance. Tailors and their clients found subtle ways around the laws: concealed linings, removable ornaments, or garments that looked plain on the outside but were rich within. Fashion, ever adaptive, responded with whispers and winks. Punishments for violating sumptuary laws varied. Fines were most common, with amounts scaled to the severity of the infraction. In some cases, the offending garment would be confiscated. Repeat offenders might be shamed in public or barred from civic events. For tailors, the consequences could be worse: loss of guild status, confiscation of tools, or forced closure of their shops. Still, enforcement was uneven. Nobles were rarely punished, and the laws were often more rigorously applied to women than to men, a reflection of both gender norms and anxieties around female visibility and virtue. Religious authorities also weighed in. The Church, particularly in its more conservative moments, viewed excessive ornamentation as a form of vanity and spiritual danger. Clerical sermons often railed against the sinfulness of fine dress, particularly among women. Modesty was encouraged, and garments that revealed too much skin or emphasized the body were frowned upon. Yet, paradoxically, the church itself maintained elaborate vestments, gold-threaded chasubles, jewel-encrusted mitres demonstrating how the visual language of power operated even within sacred spaces. Despite their repressive intent, sumptuary laws inadvertently fueled creativity. Designers and tailors adapted to the constraints, producing fashionable garments that complied in spirit while subverting the letter. New styles emerged, using innovative cuts or stitching to imply elegance without overt opulence. The very act of dressing became a negotiation between law and desire, appearance and identity. For the wealthy, it was a challenge to express individuality within boundaries. For the aspirational, it was a coded message: I may not be a noble, but I understand their language. The laws also revealed the deep connection between clothing and political order. In moments of unrest, plagues, wars, economic downturns, sumptuary laws often intensified. Leaders feared the breakdown of visible hierarchy. Clothing was a stabilizing symbol, a way of preserving the illusion of control. Yet these efforts were never entirely successful. Fashion continued to evolve, and the dream of upward mobility never died. If one could not be born into silk, perhaps one could wear it quietly or dye one's wool in a shade close enough to pass. The body, clothed, remained the last frontier of ambition. Over time, many of these laws faded. They became too difficult to enforce, too easy to circumvent. The rise of a bourgeois middle class, the spread of printed fashion plates, and the eventual democratization of wealth eroded the rigid distinctions once maintained by decree. But for centuries, the loom was watched. Thread was measured not only in inches, but in privilege, and every seam sewn was subject to the gaze of authority, ready to deem it too long, too loud, too much. In the world of medieval clothing, fashion was never free. It moved within invisible fences, stitched with law and guarded by custom. Yet the human spirit, expressive and inventive, always found a way to speak. And even in the face of regulation, the cloth still whispered dreams, not just of beauty, but of change. Within the cold stone walls of medieval castles and courts, the language of fabric reached its most extravagant and symbolic form. Here, among tapestries and torchlight, fashion was not merely adornment. It was a living performance of rank, power, lineage, and taste. The nobility dressed not just to please or to protect, but to command. Their clothing was architecture, ceremony, and spectacle, woven with wealth and stitched with intent. From the rustle of silk in a banquet hall to the sweeping train of a gown on cathedral steps, the robes of lords and ladies were extensions of their authoritas oft armor in the theater of feudal power. At the heart of noble attire was opulence. The fabrics themselves were treasures: velvet from Italy, silk from Byzantium or the Far East, fine linen from Flanders. These materials, dyed in deep, luminous shades, indigo, crimson, emerald, gold, announced one's place in the social order with every shimmer and fold. Garments were lined with fur, often ermine or miniver, not merely for warmth, but for visual contrast. The white fur of ermine, speckled with black tail-tips, became a particularly potent status symbol, traditionally reserved for royalty and high-ranking nobles. Men of the noble class wore garments that emphasized presence and volume. The tunic gave way to the houppelande in the 14th and 15th centuries, a floor-length robe with massive sleeves, thick collars, and embroidered trim. Belted high at the waist, it created an hourglass silhouette that conveyed both grace and grandeur. Beneath it, fitted doublets and hose offered structure and support, while richly patterned tabards or surcoats might be worn for tournaments and public appearances. Colors often carried heraldic meaning. To wear one's family colors was to wear one's legacy, visible to all. Noble women's attire was even more elaborate, layer upon layer, built toward a silhouette of majesty. The undergown, the main gown, and outer garments, like the mantle or pelison. These were adorned with embroidery, pearls, brocade, and sometimes even semi-precious stones. Bodices were laced or fastened with jeweled clasps. Sleeves were detachable, sometimes dragging on the ground in a statement of impracticality and leisure. The gowns trailed behind their wearers in long trains that required servants to carry them, a luxury only available to those far removed from labor. Headdresses became a key focal point of noble women's fashion. In the early medieval period, veils and wimples signaled piety and modesty, but by the 14th century, headwear grew increasingly dramatic. The hennin, a tall, conical headdress, sometimes over 2 feet high, emerged in Burgundy and spread to courts across Europe. Veils cascaded from its tip, framing the face like a waterfall of gauze. Other styles, such as the butterfly headdress or heart-shaped escoffion, turned women's heads into sculptural marvels, visible from across a great hall. Such fashion was not just ornamental, It was aspirational, architectural, and a mark of elite femininity. Jewelry and accessories completed the courtly ensemble. Brooches, rings, girdles, and chains were not only beautiful, they were encoded with messages. A ring might bear a family crest or love inscription. A belt adorned with enamel or gemstones served as both fashion and dowry. Purses, often intricately beaded or embroidered, were tied at the waist. Gloves, perfumed and soft, were exchanged as tokens of favor. Even footwear was customized: slippers of velvet, boots of leather, too fine for travel, sometimes with curled toes, indicating a wearer who never walked far alone. The rituals of dressing in noble households were formal affairs. Lords and ladies rarely dressed themselves without assistance. Attendants helped fasten laces, arrange folds, and pin veils. The act of dressing became a daily ceremonial display of wealth and refinement, enacted even before the mirror. In royal courts, these rituals were public. Kings and queens were dressed before select audiences, reinforcing their divine right to rule with each luxurious layer. Clothes were thus a tool of governance, an instrument of awe. Sumptuary laws were most lenient toward the nobility, allowing them to indulge in silks, furs, and imported fabrics that others were forbidden. Yet, even within their ranks, fashion was wielded carefully. To dress above one's station within the noble hierarchy could invite ridicule or, worse, censure from one's peers. Elegance was expected. Excess, especially when tasteless or premature, could be a social hazard. Styles evolved with the tides of royal favor. When the court of France favored tight sleeves and square necklines, the trend rippled across Europe. To fall behind these fashions was to risk seeming provincial, out of touch, or even disloyal. Noble garments were rarely static. They were refashioned, resized, relined, and repurposed. A gown worn to a coronation might later be shortened into a riding dress, its trim transferred to a new bodice. Cloaks were relined, sleeves replaced, hymns reworked. The nobility did not waste fabric. They recycled beauty within their own sphere. Clothing passed down among family members, adapted as fortunes rose or fell. Tailors served families across generations, understanding not just the fit of a shoulder, but the rhythms of a house. In some, noble clothing was a world unto itself, a spectacle of texture and technique, of social choreography and sartorial ambition. It spoke in colors, draped in lineage, and moved with ceremony. The court was a catwalk of influence, and every garment a statement of who belonged and who did not. Through sleeves that swept the ground and silks that shimmered in candlelight, the nobility cloaked themselves in power, pageantry, and permanence. In a world defined by appearance, to dress nobly was to be nobler, at the very least, to appear so convincingly. In the quiet chambers of a stone manor, as morning light filtered through stained glass windows, a noblewoman prepared to dress. Her day began not with haste, but with ritual and hour, or more devoted to transforming her body into the vision expected of her station. This transformation was more than aesthetic. Each layer she donned, each fastening adjusted by a lady's maid, was a reflection of gendered duty, virtue, and grace. For noble women in the Middle Ages, clothing was not simply a matter of fashion, but a carefully constructed narrative of femininity, one stitched from social expectation, religious doctrine, and courtly performance. The first layer was always linen, a chemise or smock, often finely woven and embroidered at the neck and sleeves. It touched the skin directly, a quiet expression of both purity and practicality. The linen served to protect outer garments from sweat and body oils, but also formed the canvas on which elegance would be built. This underlayer was rarely seen, but its quality and cleanliness hinted at a woman's refinement and attention to domestic detail virtues, praised by both religious authorities and romantic poets alike. Over the chemise came the kirtle, a tightly fitted gown with laced sides or front, designed to give structure and shape to the body. The kirtle was often of fine wool or silk and might be sleeveless, allowing for the addition of detachable sleeves made of contrasting fabric. It hugged the torso and pushed the bust upward in the style favored in the later medieval period, creating a long, lean silhouette. While modern sensibilities might see this as provocative, in its time the look signified courtly beauty, modest, elongated, and controlled. The female body was to be celebrated, yes, but also disciplined, and the kirtle enforced that tension with every tug of the laces. The overgown, whether a surcoat, cotehardie, or sideless gown, was where opulence took center stage. These gowns might be trimmed in fur, adorned with gold thread, or lined with imported brocade. The sideless surcoat, in particular, revealed the fitted kirtle beneath in dramatic fashion, with its wide openings at the sides flaring from the shoulders to the hips. To modern eyes, it may seem surprisingly bold, but at the time it was a controlled boldness meant to highlight status and restraint. The finer the fabric, the longer the train, the more elaborate the sleeve, the higher the lady's place in the world. Accessories played a significant role in finishing the look. A girdle or decorative belt might be slung low on the hips or worn tightly at the waist, often hung with charms, keys, or purses. Jewelry was chosen with care. A single ring might carry a family crest. A locket might contain a religious relic. Pearls and gold were favored for their purity and warmth, while sapphires and garnets added color and symbolic meaning, loyalty, chastity, courage. Yet ornamentation was expected to remain within the boundaries of modesty. To be too richly adorned, especially in secular settings, could invite rumors of vanity or impropriety. Perhaps most iconic was the headwear. A noble woman's hair, once married, was almost always covered in public. This could take the form of a veil, a linen wimple that wrapped under the chin and across the chest, or more elaborate constructions like the hennin or butterfly headdress. These towering forms, supported by wire and starched linen, made women appear taller, more statuesque, tealized symbols of elegance and refinement. The veil that flowed from their tips could be yards long, trailing behind like a comet's tail. Such headwear turned the woman into a spectacle of grace, her every movement calculated and slow. Dressing was often not a solitary act. Ladies of means were assisted by maids or companions who helped with laces, fastenings, and arranging of folds. These moments were private, yet highly social, an opportunity for gossip, confession, and quiet communion. Clothing also became a medium for bonding between women of different ranks, as maids learned the tastes of their mistresses and inherited their cast-off gowns. Over time, an entire female economy emerged around the care, alteration, and refinement of noble clothing. But for all its beauty, a noble woman's wardrobe was also a burden. Movement was restricted. Clothing was heavy and required careful handling. Trains had to be lifted while walking. Delicate fabrics could not be soiled. Time-consuming maintenance, from brushing velvets to combing furs, was essential. And above all, fashion was a form of surveillance. A frayed hem or overly vivid color might provoke whispers. A bodice cut to low could become the subject of ecclesiastical reprimand. One dressed not only to impress, but to conformand, to avoid the dangers of female visibility in a world that policed it harshly. Clothing also reflected transitions in a woman's life. A maiden might wear brighter colors and flowing sleeves. A wife, more subdued tones and tightly bound hair. A widow might dan somber hues gray, black, or undyed woolen, cover her face with a veil of mourning. These visual cues communicated life stages without words, and even in death, a lady's final garments, a shroud of white linen, a ring upon the finger, told her story. Her fashion became her memory. Thus, the making of a lady was as much a cultural process as a sartorial one. Through fabric and fastenings, she was shaped into the embodiment of virtue, poise, and legacy. Her clothes were her script, her armor, her stage. In every lace tied and every train adjusted, she was preparing not just for the day, but for a world that saw her first in silk, and only then, perhaps, in substance. In a sunlit courtyard, a knight tightened the leather straps of his shoes, while a squire brought forward pieces of polished steel. Elsewhere, his wife watched from an arched balcony, her own garments layered with silks and furs, the embroidered crest of their house visible across her mantle, though separated by fabric and function. The knight's armor and the lady's gown shared something fundamental. Both were carefully crafted symbols of status, identity, and intent. In the Middle Ages, fashion and warfare were not separate worlds. They overlapped in surprising ways, as martial design influenced civilian dress and noble garments often drew upon the aesthetics of the battlefield. Armor in the medieval period evolved in parallel with clothing. In the early centuries, warriors wore mail hauberks, long, interlinked metal shirts, silver-padded tunics called gambesons. These quilted underlayers absorbed the impact of blows and prevented chafing from the iron rings. But even here, personal style emerged. Mail could be dyed or darkened, hoods edged with colored embroidery, and belts designed with ornate buckles. The surcoat, a sleeveless cloth garment worn over armor, became a canvas for heraldry, bearing family crests and colors that turned the warrior into a walking banner on the field. By the 14th and 15th centuries, full-plate armor became more common among the elite, and with it came increased opportunities for customization. Artisans shaped breastplates, gauntlets, and helmets not only for function, but for beauty. Etched patterns, gilded rivets, and even inlaid scenes adorned suits of armor worn by princes and dukes. Tournament armor was especially elaborate, designed to dazzle spectators as much as to deflect blows. Helm crests in the shape of animals or mythological creatures crowned knights' heads, turning each joust into a kind of martial pageant. This martial grandeur bled into civilian fashion. The fitted doublet, worn by men across the social spectrum, owed its structure to the padded gambeson. Its tight torso and row of buttons echoed the form-fitting lines of armor. Slashed sleeves, which revealed colorful linings beneath, were inspired by wounds in battlefield attire, romanticized and transformed into a fashion statement. The practice of wearing belts low on the hips, especially among young noblemen, mimicked the sword belt and suggested readiness for action. Even boots and hats adopted shapes reminiscent of military gear, pointed toes like spurs, feathers, and badges like crests. Clothing was also used to display martial achievements. Victorious knights often had their armor or fragments of it, incorporated into ceremonial clothing. A cape lined with wolf fur from a winter campaign, a tunic embroidered with battle dates and symbols, a chain worn in honor of a captured banner. All these blended the language of war with the performance of power. To dress like a warrior, even in peacetime, was to remind the world of one's strength, loyalty, and courage. Women, too, engaged with this blend of armor and elegance. While they did not wear battlefield gear, noble women often dressed in styles that reflected chivalric ideals. Gowns with high collars and stiffened bodices evoked the protective rigidity of armor. Decorative girdles, studded with metal, hung with symbolic charms mirrored sword belts in both form and symbolism. In courtly love traditions, women were described as both prize and fortress, their virtue to be defended and their presence to inspire valor. Some literary heroines were even depicted wearing armor in allegorical form, like Joan of Arc's real-life donning of male martial dress would ignite both reverence and heresy trials. Ceremonial dress at knighthood ceremonies also reflected this interplay. When a young man was dubbed a knight, he often wore a white tunic symbolizing purity, a red robe for bloodshed and courage, and a black mantle to represent the mysteries of death. These colors were deeply symbolic, but they were also fashionable, chosen for the emotional and visual impact they carried. The rituals themselves were as much about theater as tradition, with garments playing an integral role in the knight's transformation. Armor was not without its limitations. However, it was costly, cumbersome, and confined to those who could afford it. Maintaining a suit of armor required servants, time, and resources, polishing, oiling, and repairing after each use. Similarly, the clothing that emulated martial-style structured doublets, metal thread embroidery, and luxurious fur-lined capes was beyond the reach of most. Yet its influence trickled down. Even commoners might wear belts adorned with brass studs, or boots cut in patterns reminiscent of cavalry gear. The dream of the knight, the image of honor, strength, and masculine grace permeated the fashion of the age. In the grand courts of Europe, fashion shows and tournaments often blurred together. Pages strutted in livery, mimicking their master's armor. Heralds wore tabards emblazoned with crests. Lords and ladies watched from balconies in clothing that paid homage to the ideals of the battlefield. Even dances and feasts were choreographed around martial symbols. The Middle Ages revered the knight not just as a soldier, but as an icon of order, gallantry, and magnificence. And clothing became one of the most enduring ways to wear that iconography long after the sword was sheathed. Thus, the elegance of medieval fashion was shaped not only by looms and needles, but by the clang of steel and the rhythm of marching feet. The battlefield and the ballroom, the tilt yard and the tailor's shop were more connected than they first appeared, through structured silhouettes, metallic threads, and heroic motifs. The influence of armor endured in the very seams of medieval style, reminding wearers and watchers alike that nobility was as much about appearance as it was about action. Within the shadowy cloisters of monasteries and the towering naves of cathedrals, a different kind of fashion held sway, one dictated not by the whims of court or the ambitions of trade, but by devotion, obedience, and spiritual discipline. The garments of the clergy were not designed to dazzle or seduce. They were designed to conceal, to humble, and to align the wearer with sacred purpose. And yet, even in their austerity, these garments bore layers of meaning, hierarchy, and occasionally surprising beauty. In the Middle Ages, the clothing of monks, nuns, priests and bishops spoke volumes about the invisible world they served. At the most modest level were the habits of monastic communities. A monk's clothing varied depending on the order to which he belonged. Benedictines, for example, wore simple black habits made from undyed wool, black being the color of humility and death to the world. Cistercians adopted white or gray habits to reflect purity and asceticism. The habit itself consisted of a tunic, a scapular, and a cowl or hood. These garments were loose, durable, and made for work and prayer alike. Nothing was fitted or flattering. All was meant to minimize vanity and emphasize uniformity. Nuns dressed similarly, with long tunics and veils, often accompanied by wimples that wrapped around the chin and neck. Their clothing, too, was dictated by order. Some wore coarse wool in natural colors, others were allowed black or dark blue. The veil was the most distinctive part of a nun's attire, symbolizing her marriage to Christ and separation from the secular world. On the day of her vows, a novice was often clothed in her habit in a ritual mirroring marriage, and from that moment forward, her clothing became both her shield and her declaration. Despite the emphasis on simplicity, clerical garments were not immune to the rhythms of change. As monastic orders grew in power and wealth, some communities developed more elaborate versions of their traditional attire. Hoods were lined with fur in colder climates. Scapulars were embroidered for feast days. And in some cases, high-ranking abbots or abbesses adopted robes nearly indistinguishable from noble garments, albeit in more muted tones. These changes sparked internal reform movements, with some monastics calling for a return to the rough habits and bare feet of earlier centuries. Beyond the monasteries, secular clergy, parish priests, bishops, canons wore vestments that were rich in symbolism and often in material. The basic garment was the alb, a long white robe symbolizing purity, worn under all other vestments. Over this came the stole, a narrow strip of cloth draped around the neck and shoulders, marking the authority of the ordained. The chasuble, a large, ornate outer garment, was worn during Mass and changed colors with the liturgical calendar: white for holy days, red for martyrs, green for ordinary time, and purple for penance. These vestments were often made of silk, brocade, or cloth of gold, and richly embroidered with crosses, saints, and sacred texts. Bishops and cardinals wore even more elaborate garb: mitre-stole pointed hats during ceremonies, while croziers, shepherds, crooks of precious metal, symbolized pastoral authority. The cope, a voluminous cape fastened at the chest, could be a masterpiece of medieval textile art. Its flowing fabric, heavy with gold thread and adorned with scenes from Scripture. Such garments were designed not merely for beauty, but for awe. They transformed the clergyman into a living icon, a bridge between the mortal world and the divine. But clerical dress was not without controversy. Critics within and outside the church decried the opulence of some vestments, arguing that such splendor contradicted the message of humility preached from the pulpit. Preachers like Bernard of Clairvaux, and later reformers such as John Wycliffe and the Lollards, condemned the church's fascination with luxury, including its costly robes. They called for a return to apostolic poverty, a church of sandals, not silks. This tension would continue to simmer and eventually erupt in the reformations of the later centuries. Still, the visual power of clerical attire remained central to medieval religious life. Clothing helped define sacred space. A priest's change from everyday garb into vestments marked the transition from ordinary time to holy ritual. The bell ringing, the incense rising, and the glittering chasuble all worked together to transport worshippers beyond the physical world. Even outside of liturgy, clergy were expected to dress modestly and recognizably. A long black cassock, a tonsured head, or a modest cross worn on a chain instantly identified one as a man of God and conferred both respect and expectation. Clothing also played a role in clerical punishment and penance. Those who sinned, whether priest or lay person, might be required to wear sackcloth and ashes, a literal and visible sign of humility and repentance. Excommunicated individuals were denied burial in sacred garments. Even in death, what one wore mattered. Bishops were interred in full vestments, as if prepared to enter eternal liturgy, while monks were wrapped in the habits they had worn daily, their hoods drawn over their faces, their bodies cradled in prayer. In the medieval imagination, the body and soul were intertwined, and so too were clothing and sanctity. Through folds of wool and flashes of silk, through thread and trim and embroidered saints, the clergy's garments shaped the spiritual landscape of the age. Whether cloaked in humility or crowned in splendor, the servants of the church were dressed for a different kind of warfare, not with swords, but with sacraments, not for courts, but for salvation. Their fashion was a theology, woven into being with every thread. In the heart of a medieval village, a child darted barefoot through a muddy lane, a tunic flapping around thin legs as laughter echoed behind. In the stone corridors of a noble hall, another child, hair neatly braided, sleeves embroidered, recited her lessons, while a nursemaid adjusted the fall of her veil. Though born into vastly different worlds, both children were clothed not only in fabric but in expectation. In the Middle Ages, childhood was not understood as a wholly separate stage of life, and this was reflected in what children wore. Their garments were often smaller versions of adult attire, but the clothing of medieval children carried its own rhythms, its own logic, and its own quiet charm. For most children, especially those of the peasantry and working classes, clothing was above all functional. Young boys and girls alike wore simple tunics made of wool or coarse linen, usually belted at the waist with a rope or strip of fabric. Until about the age of 7 or 8, there was little distinction between the sexes in terms of clothing. Practicality ruled. Garments needed to allow for growth, withstand hard play, and survive the repeated cycles of wear and repair. Many clothes were handed down through siblings, patched with mismatched fabric, and often cut from the remnants of adult garments. Shoes were rare among poorer children, worn mostly during colder months or on trips to market or church. Instead, children went barefoot through much of the year, their feet toughened by gravel paths and farm soil. In colder climates or seasons, they might wrap their feet in rags or use simple clogs if the household could spare them. Cloaks were minimal, if worn at all more often. Extra tunics or aprons were layered for warmth. Mothers stitched garments in the evenings, often while watching their younger children, turning spare hours into threads of necessity. Noble and merchant-class children, by contrast, had wardrobes that reflected their family's status and aspirations. While their early clothing also mimicked that of adults, it was often more ornate, carefully tailored, and decorated. A young girl might wear a kirtle of fine wool or even imported fabric, dyed in pastel hues, with lace-edged sleeves and a linen underdress. A young boy of noble birth would wear a fitted tunic, hose, and a short cloak, perhaps even a tiny sword or dagger, symbolic rather than functional. These garments not only signaled status, but prepared the child for their expected future roles within the aristocracy or the guilds. Headdress was an important part of a noble child's clothing, especially for girls. A young girl's hair was typically braided and covered with a veil or cap, and as she approached puberty, her headwear became more structured and modest. Boys often wore felt caps or hoods, especially in outdoor settings. Head coverings were not just fashion, they marked transitions in age, virtue, and identity. A girl's first veil was a sign that she was leaving behind childhood and preparing for marriage or the convent. Clothing, in this way, was a slow rehearsal for the adult roles that waited. Education also influenced clothing. Boys studying in cathedral schools or under private tutors wore clean but simple garments, suitable for indoor learning and religious settings. In some places, schoolboys wore identifying colors or sashes to signal their status. Girls educated in convents or noble households often had plainer wardrobes than their secular peers, designed to emphasize humility and focus. Yet, even here, there were flourishes. A ribbon tucked into a girdle, a sleeve embroidered with an initial, a brooch given on a name day. Children found small ways to express identity within the confines of their role. Rites of passage were marked by changes in dress. One of the most notable was the breeching of Boiser on the age of 7. A boy who had previously worn a loose tunic, like his sisters, was given his first pair of hose and a doublet, signifying his transition into early manhood. This moment was sometimes celebrated with small gifts or family gatherings. Similarly, a girl's first full gown or veil marked her entry into a more structured and monitored world, often accompanied by lessons in household management or embroidery. Festive occasions, feast days, weddings, christenings offered children rare opportunities to dress in their finest. For noble children, this might mean miniature versions of courtly fashion, including velvet, silk, or brocade. For peasant children, a clean tunic and perhaps a new belt or garland of flowers would suffice. These events were documented in chronicles, illuminated manuscripts, and occasionally sculpture, where children are shown in charming and often idealized attire, hand in hand with parents or playing among the saints. Despite their social position, children's clothing had to balance formality with play. Tailors and mothers alike designed garments that could be loosened, let out, or adjusted as children grew. Few families could afford entirely new wardrobes for their young, even among the wealthy, and so garments were frequently altered, hems lengthened, sleeves widened, waistbands replaced. This economy of reuse made clothing into a visual record of growth and change, stitched with the passing of time. In medieval art and literature, children were rarely the focus spot when they appeared. Their clothing told us who they were meant to become. The monk's apprentice wore his robe modestly. The young noble nighttime training already bore the colors of his house. The clothing of children, though often overlooked, offered a tender window into medieval life, a world where innocence met expectation, where wool and linen were not only for warmth, but for the slow, careful shaping of identity. From mud-spattered tunics to jewel-trimmed gowns, the garments of childhood carried the first dreams of who these young souls might one day be. On a biting January morning, a farmer rose from his straw-stuffed bedding and reached for his thickest woolen cloak, its edges stiff from moisture absorbed during last evening's snowfall. Across the manor, in the solar, warmed by a modest fire, the lord of the estate fastened his fur-lined mantle at the shoulder and adjusted the cuffs of his long houppelande. Whether born to labor or luxury, All medieval people contended with the realities of the seasons, and their wardrobes had to adapt to an environment that could be both unforgiving and unpredictable. Seasonal fashion in the Middle Ages was shaped not just by weather, but by ingenuity, social custom, and necessity. Winter posed the greatest challenge. Without central heating, people relied on layering and natural insulation to stay warm. Cloaks, mantles, and hoods made of thick wool were staples in every household. The wealthier classes had the luxury of fur fox, squirrel, rabbit, and for the richest, ermine or sable used to line garments or trim sleeves and collars. Even the humble peasant might fasten bits of sheepskin to the inside of a tunic for added warmth. In colder climates or harsh winters, people stuffed straw or rags into their boots, or wrapped woolen bands around their calves and arms for extra insulation. The layering wasn't stylish shit, was survival. Undergarments, too, were adapted. Instead of lighter linen shifts, winter versions were made from heavier flax or even blended with wool. Double layers of hose became common for both men and women, tied securely to belts or girdles. Gloves or mittens were crafted from felted wool or leather, sometimes lined with scraps of fur. Hoods with long liripipes, narrow trailing tails, were not only fashionable, but could be wrapped around the head or neck for warmth. Nightwear in winter was similarly adapted. Many slept fully clothed or wrapped in cloaks, with only their noses exposed to the air beneath heavy woolen blankets. Summer, on the other hand, required a different kind of adjustment. Though wool remained the most common fabric, it was woven more loosely or in thinner weights during warmer months. Linen, prized for its breathability and lightness, became the preferred material for undergarments and even entire garments among those who could afford it. Workers might wear tunics with sleeves rolled and secured with cords, and children often went barefoot and bare-legged. Light head coverings, caps, veils, straw hats were essential for protection against the sun. Tans and burns were not fashionable. Pale skin denoted refinement and a life spent indoors. Color choices, too, shifted with the seasons. In summer, brighter dyes made from fresh plants, weld for yellow, madder for red, and woad for bluebee came available, and many households took the opportunity to refresh older garments with new color. Winter colors were typically darker and more muted, both out of practicality and mood. Deep browns, grays, and natural wool colors dominated winter wardrobes, while soft greens and faded ochres became more common in spring and summer attire. The cycle of the seasons echoed in the hues people wore, each stitch tied to time and place. Festivals and religious holidays also influenced seasonal dress. At Easter and other spring feasts, new garments were often presented or worn to symbolize renewal. Peasants might wear their cleanest or most colorful tunic, while nobles unveiled garments with floral embroidery or light silk trim. In contrast, the Advent season before Christmas called for darker, more somber attire, aligning with the Church's call to reflection and restraint. These traditions wove seasonal changes directly into the rituals of daily life, where what one wore was both a personal and communal expression. Rainy seasons demanded practical solutions. Waterproofing as we know it didn't exist, but people relied on cloaks treated with animal fat or wax, and hoods that extended over the shoulders. Wooden clogs or pattens overshoes with raised, soles-kept feet, dry and elevated in muddy streets. In rural areas, some wore cloaks with built-in hoods that doubled as blankets or rain covers, while in cities, canopies and arcades offered limited shelter. Clothing wasn't merely changed by the weather. It was designed with adaptation in mind. Travel further influenced seasonal fashion. Pilgrims journeying in winter required specific garb, thick boots, reinforced cloaks, gloves, and multiple layers, sometimes even carrying warming stones. In summer, travelers wore lighter garments, but still covered themselves from the sun and dust with long tunics, headscarves, and veils. Merchants on the road learned to dress in durable fabrics that could withstand heat by day and chill by night. Their garments might include detachable linings, layered coifs, or reversible cloaks. Practical fashion ahead of its time. Storage and preservation were crucial. When summer came, heavier winter garments were carefully folded and packed away, sometimes with lavender, rosemary, or camphor to deter moths. In noble households, this was the work of chamberlains and laundresses. In humbler homes, it was a communal task, with older children helping to beat air and refold heavy cloaks and woolen hoods. Clothes were valuable, often representing a significant portion of a family's wealth, and preserving them across seasons was an act of stewardship. The turning of the seasons, then, was not merely a change in temperature. It reshaped the rhythms of dressing, washing, repairing, and choosing. In a world so deeply attuned to the natural world, fashion flowed with the elements, thicker as the frost came, lighter with the thaw, and always alive to the demands of the earth. Whether beneath the weight of snow or the blaze of the summer sun, the people of the Middle Ages dressed in harmony with time, cloaked in wool, wrapped in linen, and stitched into the seasons. In a small village chapel, a woman knelt in prayer, her veil pulled low over her brow, her hands folded atop a simple woolen gown. At the great cathedral in Chartres, a bishop moved slowly through the nave in robes that shimmered with gold thread, each embroidered cross catching the candlelight like a star, from modest parishioners to high-ranking clerics. The faithful of medieval Europe lived in a world where fashion and faith were inextricably intertwined. What one wore to worship wore, just as importantly, in everyday life reflected one's relationship with the divine. In the Middle Ages, clothing was not only a signal of social status, but a mirror of religious devotion, modesty, and piety. The Church wielded immense influence over every aspect of medieval life, including how people dressed. Sermons regularly warned against the dangers of vanity and excess, especially for women. To dress too richly was seen not only as prideful, but as a spiritual risk, a temptation, both for the wearer and for those who beheld her. Modesty became a central value in Christian fashion. Garments were expected to conceal rather than reveal, to humble rather than elevate. Women covered their hair with veils or wimples, not only out of custom, but as an expression of humility before God. Men, too, were expected to dress soberly, with clergy often setting the example in dark robes and simple cuts. Yet, even within these limits, religious fashion was full of meaning and complexity. Pilgrims, for example, wore distinct clothing that marked them as travelers on sacred journeys. A wide-brimmed hat, a long cloak, and a staff were standard, often adorned with badges or scallop shells indicating their destinations: Santiago de Compostela, Rome, or Jerusalem. These garments served practical purposes: protection from the elements and identification on the road, but they also turned the pilgrim's body into a visible testament of devotion. To meet a pilgrim was to witness a living act of faith, written not in scripture, but in seams. Religious orders had their own fashion codes, strictly enforced and rich in symbolism. The gray habits of Franciscans reflected their vow of poverty and closeness to the earth. The black robes of Benedictines signaled discipline and humility. The white garments of Cistercians and Carthusians stood for purity and simplicity. These clothes were not meant to flatter, but to strip the wearer of worldly identity, binding them to the collective identity of the order. The cut, color, and fabric were deliberate and controlled, a form of visual theology that shaped not only the community's appearance, but its spiritual orientation. The laity, too, were expected to dress appropriately for church. Feast days called for cleaner, finer garments, though always within bounds. To appear at Mass in overly bright colors or extravagant styles was frowned upon, and in some regions even punishable. Head coverings were mandatory for women inside the church, and certain accessories, like flashy jewelry or excessive embroidery, were discouraged. These customs weren't merely social, they were seen as part of maintaining the sanctity of the space. The body was to be presented as a vessel of reverence, and clothing played a key role in shaping that presentation. Conversely, the church also made full use of fashion to convey authority and grandeur in its higher ranks. Bishops, cardinals, and popes wore vestments made of the finest materials, cloth of gold, rich velvets, and heavily embroidered silks. Their garments were encrusted with pearls, trimmed with ermine, and layered to dramatic effect. Mitres rose like crowns, and stoles hung with ornamental weight. These vestments were not personal indulgences, but visual metaphors signifying the glory of God and the gravity of the sacraments. A high Mass could be as visually overwhelming as it was spiritually stirring, with clouds of incense, brilliant candlelight, and a cascade of gleaming fabric enveloping the senses. Religious symbolism also influenced fashion beyond the church walls. Cross motifs appeared in embroidery, jewelry, and even buttons. Some women wore girdles, etched with prayers, believed to offer spiritual protection. Pilgrim badges and relic pouches were worn openly on garments, both as testimony to faith and as charms against misfortune. In times of plague or political turmoil, wearing a symbol of the Virgin Mary or a local patron saint offered not only hope, but a sense of armor against unseen dangers. Faith was quite literally worn on the sleeve. Major religious events shaped clothing practices on a larger scale. Lent, a time of penitence, saw people dress in darker, plainer clothes. Advent brought a similar visual austerity. Easter, on the other hand, encouraged the wearing of new or freshly cleaned garments, symbolic of rebirth and renewal. Funerals dictated black or unbleached wool. Weddings, especially among the wealthy, became opportunities to display virtue through elegant yet modest attire. Even excommunication had its fashion, the removal of all religious symbols and the donning of penitential robes, often of undyed linen or sackcloth. Monastic influence extended into fashion trends as well. The sober, layered look of the clergy influenced urban merchants and scholars, who began to favor black robes, high collars, and minimal decoration as signs of intellectual seriousness and moral probity. In universities, the academic gown evolved from clerical dress in many ways to dress like a man of the church. Chevan, if one was not ordained, was to signal a life devoted to study, contemplation, and moral discipline. In the medieval world, fashion and faith were not opposing forces, but intertwined expressions of identity. Clothing was both a spiritual tool and a social language, a way to signal humility, demonstrate obedience, and mark oneself as a child of God. From the simplest pilgrim's badge to to the most resplendent cope, the garments worn by the faithful stitched devotion into every seam, and in doing so, they wrapped the body not just in wool or linen, but in intention, belief, and the invisible grace of the sacred. Along the muddy lanes of a bustling medieval village, feet shuffled and clattered across packed earth, straw-strewn floors, and cobbled walkways. Some were bare, calloused, and stained from labor, while others stepped with deliberate poise in soft leather shoes or wooden pattens that clacked against stone. In the Middle Ages, footwear was more than just protection. It was a marker of occupation, class, mobility, and vanity. Though often overlooked in grand paintings or gilded manuscripts, the shoes people wore didn't told a rich and layered story about daily life, social boundaries, and the ingenuity of those who moved through a complex and varied world. For the majority of the population, footwear was a rare and practical possession. Peasants, laborers, and children frequently went barefoot, especially in warmer months, not for lack of need, but due to the cost and difficulty of maintaining even the simplest shoes. The ground itself hardened their soles, while the fields and farms demanded a kind of direct contact with the earth. Yet, when footwear was worn, it was typically a basic leather turn shoe, a single piece of leather sewn around the foot, sometimes with a thin sole and often tied with a thong or leather strap. These were handmade, usually at home or by a local cobbler, and were expected to last through repairs and seasons of wear. In rainy or muddy regions, particularly in towns with unpaved streets, pattens were indispensable. These were wooden overshoes with raised platforms that strapped over regular footwear, lifting the wearer several inches above the muck. While clumsy to walk in, pattens protected shoes from the elements and made a distinctive clacking sound as people moved through markets and alleys. For women in long gowns, pattens also helped keep fabric from dragging through the filth of the streets. Their use became so widespread that some churches banned them indoors due to the noise they caused on stone floors. Among the urban classes and merchants, footwear began to take on more form and variety. Ankle boots, made of sturdier leather, became common for men who traveled frequently, while women favored low-cut shoes that allowed glimpses of colored hose or embroidered stockings. Shoemaking evolved as a skilled trade, with cobblers and cordwainers distinguishing themselves by the quality of their materials and the finesse of their stitching. Leather was tanned in local workshops, dyed in shades of brown, black, and occasionally red, and softened through a laborious process involving lime, urine, and animal fats, a pungent but essential craft. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the nobility and wealthy classes began to indulge in increasingly elaborate footwear. Shoes were no longer purely functional, they became fashionable. Pointed shoes, known as poulaines or crackles, emerged in court circles and quickly became a symbol of elite style, with exaggerated toes that sometimes extended over a foot in length. Poulaines required the wearer to walk with care, and sometimes even necessitated the use of garters or chains to keep the tips from flapping. Ladies of the court wore delicate slippers made from velvet, brocade, or fine leather, often adorned with embroidery, pearls, or decorative cutouts. These shoes, though visually impressive, were not meant for the outdoors. Carried to feasts or courtly events, they were often worn only indoors or over more practical footwear. Some were lined with fur for warmth or trimmed with gold thread, turning the foot into yet another canvas for display. A glimpse of a fine shoe beneath a hemline could be as alluring and telling as a jeweled headdress or silken sleeve. Shoes also played roles in ceremonies and customs. In weddings, shoes could be given as gifts or used in playful rituals, such as throwing a shoe after the departing bride, for Luca, precursor to the modern tossing of the bouquet. In legal contexts, particularly in rural areas, the giving of a shoe might seal a contract or land deal, symbolizing trust and permanence. Even in death, footwear mattered. Some people were buried in their shoes, while others had them removed as a symbol of humility before God. Shoes were not just worn, they were woven into the social and spiritual rituals of life. Different professions developed distinctive footwear suited to their needs. Blacksmiths, bakers, shepherds, and soldiers all had variations in design-reinforced soles, thicker uppers, or greater ankle support. Soldiers' boots were often hobnailed, with metal studs hammered into the soles for grip and durability. Hunters and foresters favored boots that could be laced tightly and shed water. Even the clergy adopted distinct footwear, soft-soled slippers for indoor movement, and sturdier boots for travel between parishes. Shoes were tailored not only to the person, but to their world, the terrain, the labor, the expectation. Shoemaking itself was a respected and complex trade. Apprentices trained for years to learn the craft, from cutting patterns to shaping soles over wooden lasts. Shoemakers often worked in tandem with tanners and leatherworkers, forming part of the essential economic and craft network of a town. In larger cities, shoemakers formed guilds to protect their techniques, regulate pricing, and ensure quality. These guilds sometimes provided shoes for the poor or created ceremonial footwear for festivals and processions, reinforcing their importance, not just economically, but culturally. Thus, the medieval foot was more than a point of contact with the ground. It was a canvas of class, a tool of trade, and a marker of movement through life. From the bare soles of a shepherd to the gilded polanes of a prince, footwear revealed the road a person walked. In every stitch and strap there was function, but also form, pride, and sometimes defiance. And though most medieval people never owned more than one pair, they understood intimately what it meant to walk in another's shoes, because every step was taken in rhythm with the world they built beneath them. On a wind-swept moor, a shepherd tugged his woolen hood over his ears as the sky threatened rain. In a bustling marketplace, a merchant's apprentice doffed his felt cap in respect to a noblewoman who passed by beneath a veil and stiffened headdress adorned with pearls. In a cloister, a novice carefully tucked her hair beneath a linen coif, each fold smoothed with reverent fingers. Across medieval Europe, headwear was more than a matter of warmth or modesty. It was a cultural necessity, a statement of faith, fashion, or identity. Hats, hoods, and hairstyles were key indicators of gender, class, age, and even marital status. What one wore atop the head could be as revealing as any cloak or gown. For the peasantry and laboring classes, the hood was the most common and practical choice, known as a cowl or chaperon in various forms. The medieval hood consisted of a head covering with a long, shoulder-draping cape, and often a liripipa, trailing tail that could be wrapped for warmth or style. Made from wool and often lined with linen, hoods protected from wind, rain, and sun. They could be pulled down easily when entering a church or greeting a superior. Some were brightly dyed, adding a splash of color to otherwise muted clothing. Among field workers, fishermen, and shepherds, the hood was an essential part of everyday dress. Weathered patched, and utterly indispensable. In urban centers, hats became more varied and fashionable, especially among tradesmen and merchants. Felted wool caps, flat-topped or rounded, were commonly worn by men, while barrel-like styles with brims or turned-up edges indicated regional taste. Tailors crafted hats with slits, embroidery, or even feather decorations for those who could afford them. A man's hat served both as sun protection and as a sign of self-respect. Moving it in greeting or prayer was a standard gesture of humility. For women, head coverings were a near constant presence. Girls wore simple linen caps or kerchiefs, often tied at the nape of the neck. Upon marriage, a woman was expected to keep her hair fully covered in public. The veil, wimple, and headrail became markers of modesty, piety, and propriety. The wimple, in particular, framed the face in soft folds of white linen, wrapping around the chin and neck like a halo. It was worn most commonly by nuns and older women, though it remained fashionable in certain court circles as well. The headrail, a long strip of linen draped over the head and shoulders, was versatile and could be arranged in various styles depending on region and fashion. As court fashion evolved, noble women's headwear grew increasingly elaborate. The iconic hennin, a conical headdress often associated with the later medieval period, stood tall and tapering, sometimes extending several feet above the wearer's head. Its base was secured with padded rolls and veils that floated behind like silk pennants. Variants like the truncated hinnin or butterfly headdress featured wired supports that spread veils in wide wing-like shapes. Hair itself was also a deeply symbolic element of fashion. For unmarried women, especially those of noble or merchant background, long, loose hair was a sign of youth and virginity. On feast days or during weddings, girls might wear their hair in elaborate braids, often threaded with ribbons or pearls. Once married, however, modesty dictated that hair be concealed, with few exceptions. Some women shaved or plucked their hairlines to create the fashionable high forehead, while others oiled and coiled their hair into buns beneath coifs or nets. Hair became less about expression and more about controlla, visible reminder of virtue and order. Men's hair was more freely styled, though it, too, followed trends. In early medieval centuries, long hair and beards were often associated with nobility and warrior status. As court culture grew more refined, clean-shaven faces and neatly cropped hair became the norm among elite men, especially in ecclesiastical or royal contexts. Hairstyles changed across the centuries, from the bowl-cut pageboy style to the neatly waved locks seen in portraits of late medieval courtiers. Hats and hoods complemented these styles, with fashionable men sometimes wearing caps that were slouched, feathered, or tilted to one side. Religious influence heavily shaped headwear norms. Clergy wore distinct skull caps, berettas, or wide-brimmed hats that signaled their role. Pilgrims often donned special hats marked with badges or pins from sacred sites. Monks and nuns maintained strict head coverings as part of their vows. Even in lay society, the church often dictated modesty standards, condemning extravagant headwear or uncovered heads in sacred spaces. Failure to cover the head appropriately could result in social disapproval or ecclesiastical penalty. Headwear also held ceremonial significance. Crowns, of course, stood as the ultimate symbol of power, worn by monarchs during coronations, processions, and feast days. But other headpieces, garlands of flowers, wreaths of leaves, or gold circlets were used during festivals, weddings, and religious plays. Children might wear paper crowns or embroidered caps on feast days. The head became a canvas for identity and belief. Though often dismissed as accessory, hats, hoods, and hair were central to medieval fashion. They communicated piety, status, gender, and age. They offered protection, but also display. In a world without surnames or photographs, what sat atop one's head could say everything about who they were and who they were becoming. Whether it was a shepherd's hood, a merchant's cap, a widow's veil, or a queen's towering hanine, the medieval head bore more than thought it, bore the weight of tradition, the shape of culture, and the quiet artistry of fabric and form. The Middle Ages spanned nearly 1,000 years, and over that long arc of time, fashion changed dramatically, though often at a pace far slower than the swift cycles of the modern world. The evolution of medieval clothing was not linear, but rippled and spiraled across regions and generations, shaped by war, trade, religion, and climate. What people wore in the 6th century bore little resemblance to the structured silhouettes of the 15th, and yet each thread of change was woven from what came before. To trace the progression of medieval fashion is to follow the movements of society itself, its tensions, ambitions, influences, and ideals stitched into the seams of tunics and gowns. In the early medieval period, much of Europe inherited its clothing traditions from the remnants of the Roman Empire. Tunics and cloaks formed the basic wardrobe for both men and women, typically loose-fitting, draped, and fastened with brooches or belts. Fabrics were simple and dyed wool or coarse linen, and the silhouettes emphasized function over form. The focus was warmth and coverage, especially in northern climates where winters were long and bitter. There was little distinction in fit between social classes. Difference was signaled instead through color, trim, and fabric quality. The influence of Germanic and Celtic traditions could be seen in the decoration of cloaks and the use of patterned belts or woven tablet bands. As feudal society crystallized in the 10th and 11th centuries, clothing began to subtly reflect the structures of hierarchy and chivalry. Sleeves lengthened, cloaks widened, and tunics took on greater variation in hemline and sleeve shape. Women's dresses became more voluminous, often with girdles and fitted cuffs, while men's garments remained relatively simple but began to shorten in the front for easier movement. Embroidery became more widespread, often featuring religious or geometric motifs. The influence of the church was strong, and modesty dominated both design and decoration. Still, imported fabrics, particularly from the Islamic world, began to introduce silk and brighter dyes to the European palette. The 12th and 13th centuries saw a true flowering of fashion innovation, particularly among the nobility. The Crusades had opened trade routes, bringing new fabrics, colors, and tailoring techniques from the Middle East and Byzantium. Garments became more fitted, with lacing and buttons used to contour the body in ways previously unseen. Men wore tunics that hugged the torso and flared at the hem, paired with tight-fitting hose. Rich colors, deep reds, cobalt blues, golden yellows, were now more attainable thanks to improved dyeing methods. Decorative trims, braids, and flourished, and clothing became not just practical, but increasingly aesthetic. By the 14th century, fashion had entered an era of architectural experimentation. Both men's and women's clothing became strikingly structured. For men, the cote-hardie, tightly fitted tunic with buttons down the front became a staple, often worn with a short cloak and elaborately pointed shoes. Doublets, padded for shape, emerged beneath outer garments, creating a sculpted silhouette. Women's gowns featured sweeping trains and sleeves that widened into long points or open bell shapes. This period also saw the rise of fashion as a form of flirtation and expression. Necklines lowered, waistlines rose and fell with the trends, and fine tailoring became a marker of both wealth and courtly sophistication. Headwear also reached its most extravagant heights during this time, with hennins, heart-shaped escoffions, and embroidered veils turning the female head into a platform for artistry. Men experimented with caps, hoods, and liripipes, while also adopting the chaperona hood that could be worn as a hat, scarf, or draped accessory in various configurations. The final transformation of medieval fashion into something approaching the early modern style. Garments became more complex in construction, with padded shoulders, slashed fabrics, and layered textures. Men's fashion, in particular, moved toward the bold and exaggerated, broad shoulders, short doublets, and increasingly ornamental hose. The codpiece appeared not merely as a practical solution to split hose, but as a flamboyant declaration of masculinity. Women's gowns emphasized a triangular silhouette, tight bodices with squared necklines, supported by stiffened linings, flaring into broad skirts, often worn over hoops or padded rolls. Textile, technology, and trade had advanced considerably by this point. Italy and Flanders became renowned for their weaving, while silk production expanded across Europe. Sumptuary laws tried to keep fashion in check, but they couldn't stop the spread of ideas. Printed pattern books and illustrated manuscripts helped spread new styles from one court to another. Tailors' guilds, now well established, standardized many aspects of garment making, allowing for consistent cuts and sizes. Clothing was becoming not only more beautiful, but more reproducible, foreshadowing of the mass fashion to come in later centuries. Throughout these centuries, the wardrobe of the average person evolved more slowly, shaped by availability, regional customs, and the rhythms of agricultural life. Yet even here, echoes of courtly fashion trickled down. Peasants might adopt slimmer tunics or brighter colors as dyes became more affordable. Hoods and hose reached rural villages a generation after their urban debut. Holiday garments began to mimic the shapes and styles of noblewear, if only in coarse homespun. The aspirational nature of fashion, its power to inspire dreams and signal identity, was present at every level of society. The medieval world, once cloaked in wool and linen, had expanded into a rich tapestry of textures, forms, and styles. From the straight lines of early tunics to the sculpted silhouettes of the late Gothic courts, fashion had traced the transformation of Europe itself through war, trade, religion, and imagination. It had dressed the body not only for warmth or modesty, but for memory, ritual, love, ambition, and change. Fashion had, in its quiet way, documented the soul of a civilization. In a quiet village chapel, candles flickered beside a wooden bier where a body lay, robed in its finest tunic, hands crossed over the chest, eyes closed by a grieving spouse or priest. The dead wore not just garments, but the sum of their life's identity. Across medieval Europe, death was not a moment to strip away fashion, but to reaffirm it one final time. Whether peasant or noble, monk or merchant, what the dead wore into the grave carried profound meaning. In death, as in life, clothing was a ritual, a signal, and a story. For most people, burial meant being wrapped in simple, undyed linen shroud. This plainness was deliberate, symbolizing humility and the shedding of worldly vanity. The shroud was tied at the head and feet, resembling the winding cloths described in the Gospels. In many Christian communities, this was seen as the ideal burial garb, uniting rich and poor alike in a final gesture of equality before God. Yet even this simplicity carried variation. A poor man might be wrapped in a worn bedsheet or old shift, while a wealthier townsman might be buried in finely woven linen, bleached white and trimmed with a modest cross. Bishops and abbots were buried in full vestments, albs, stoles, chasubles, just as they would wear during a solemn mass. The garments, often handmade and embroidered with sacred symbols, reflected not only the office held, but the liturgical hope that the deceased would carry on in service to God beyond the veil. Some bishops were even interred with their mitres and croziers, though sometimes these were wooden replicas rather than the precious originals. Their garments turned the body into a sacred vessel, clothed for eternity. Kings were often buried in state regalia robes of scarlet or purple, golden belts, and jeweled coronets. The practice mirrored the burial of ancient emperors and biblical kings. Their graves, sometimes reopened centuries later, revealed bodies still clad in robes of silk or clothed gold, boots still buckled, gloves delicately folded around bones. These garments were not chosen lightly. They signified continuity, legacy, and divine right. To dress a monarch for the grave was to confirm the sacred nature of kingship, even in death. Women, too, were buried with care and symbolism. Veils were nearly always included, often covering the face entirely. Jewelry was usually removed before burial, whether to be passed to heirs or for fear of theft, but rosaries, religious medallions, or crosses might be buried with the body. In some cases, a ring inscribed with a prayer or scripture would be left on a finger, a final comfort or protective charm as she passed into the unknown. Burial customs also reflected changing attitudes toward the body. Early in the medieval period, graves were simple and shallow, with bodies laid directly into the earth or placed in wooden coffins. Over time, wealthier individuals opted for stone sarcophagi, lead-lined tombs, or even elaborate effigies carved in their likeness. These monuments sometimes depicted the deceased in full regalia, with swords, crowns, or veils carved in stone, reinforcing the garments they had worn or aspired to wear in life. Beneath these images, the real body decayed in layers of wool, silk, or linen, slowly returning to the soil. Garments were chosen with care, washed and mended, if necessary. Even the poor sought to bury their loved ones with dignity, child in a repurposed shift, an old man in his feast day tunic. There were also charitable traditions around clothing the dead. In some towns, confraternities or guilds provided burial garments for the indigent, ensuring no one went into the earth naked or dishonored. This final act of generosity, clothing the dead, was considered a corporal work of mercy, a way to serve God by honoring the human body. Special attention was given to burial in times of crisis, plagues, famines, war. In such cases, bodies were often buried hastily, sometimes in mass graves, and the luxury of proper garments was lost. Yet even in these moments, survivors tried to cover the bodies with cloaks, sheets, or strips of cloth. The instinct to clothe the dead, however minimally, was deeply ingrained. Nakedness in death was associated with shame, punishment, or martyrdom. To die clothed was to die human, remembered, and mourned. These additions blurred the lines between clothing and ritual, making the garments of the dead into spiritual armor for the soul's journey. Monks were sometimes buried with cords tied around their waists, signifying their vows. Pilgrims might be laid to rest in their travel cloaks, badges still pinned to their chests, as if continuing their journey toward the heavenly city. In the end, medieval burial clothing was not about fashion, but about farewell. It was about preparing the body for what came next, whether judged by God or remembered by the living. In a world where every stitch had meaning, the final garments of life bore the weight of a soul's story. And as the grave was closed and the candles flickered low, the clothing remained not just fabric, but testimony of who they were, of who they loved, and of what they believed would come after the silence.